The night was pitch black, drenched in a silence so thick it weighed down on the forest, where even the crickets had gone quiet. Tyler, an outdoorsy 20-something who thrived on camping solo, set up his small tent beside a lake known for its mirror-still surface, which reflected the sky and trees with unnerving clarity. He was miles from civilization, deep in the woods of Maine, precisely the kind of isolation he craved. Only this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. It was a common trick of the mind, he reasoned, just the loneliness and vastness of the wild playing with him. But that night felt different, and as he lay in his tent, he couldn't ignore the unsettling stillness. He reached for his flashlight and flicked it on, casting its weak, yellow glow across the insides of his tent. His phone read 1:13 a.m., and he forced himself to lie back, telling himself that fear was irrational and that he was, indeed, alone. Then came the first sound, a faint crunch of leaves outside his tent, almost imperceptible, like someone carefully avoiding detection. Tyler's heart leapt, and he held his breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. It wasn't an animal, he was sure. Animals didn't creep with that cautious deliberation, that almost human wariness. He sat up, his every nerve bristling with awareness. Maybe it was a late-night hiker, lost and looking for help, but who would wander in these remote woods in the dead of night? Tyler unzipped the tent slowly, peeking his head out. The moon, shrouded by clouds, cast an eerie glow over the landscape, barely illuminating the thick underbrush surrounding the lake. The shadows lay heavy and twisted across the ground. He saw nothing. He closed his tent again, trying to calm himself, telling himself to stop jumping at shadows. Minutes later, he heard it again. This time it was followed by a low, almost inaudible mutter, like someone mumbling to themselves. He froze, trying to make out the words, but they were unintelligible, just a raspy whisper floating on the still air. Goosebumps rose along his arms, and he instinctively reached for his pocket knife. The whisper grew louder, broken by occasional breaths, until he could almost make out the words. But as he strained to listen, it stopped abruptly. And then a laugh, a low, guttural laugh that sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know whether to scream, run, or stay silent. He gripped his knife tightly, his palms sweaty as he fought the primal urge to flee. The laugh was still echoing when his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Tyler's breaths came fast and shallow. His mind raced through every possible scenario, trying to figure out if he was dealing with some sadistic prankster or something far worse. His fingers trembled as he fumbled for his phone, hoping to call for help. But there was no signal. That's when he noticed it. The faint outline of a figure standing just outside his tent, barely visible against the night. He couldn't see its face, just the vague shape of a person, unmoving, watching him. Every fiber in his being screamed at him to move, to get as far away from that figure as possible. But he was frozen, staring back, unable to tear his gaze away. The figure shifted slightly, and for a brief moment he thought he saw its eyes glint, catching a sliver of moonlight. They looked wrong, almost animalistic, with a malevolent intelligence that sent waves of terror crashing over him. And then it spoke, its voice low and cracked as if unused for years. "You shouldn't be here." Tyler's heart hammered wildly, and he tried to find his voice. "Who are you?" he managed, though his voice trembled. The figure tilted its head, like it was considering the question. It didn't answer, only stepped closer to the tent, close enough that he could hear the soft rustle of fabric as it moved. Tyler thought of running, of trying to escape, but he knew he wouldn't make it far in the dark. And then, without warning, the figure lunged at the tent. Tyler screamed, falling backward as the tent's flimsy walls collapsed inward, trapping him. He thrashed desperately, trying to untangle himself from the fabric as he felt something grab his ankle with an ice-cold grip. He kicked out, freeing himself just long enough to scramble out of the tent and into the open air. He ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, glancing back only once to see the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching him with those terrible, glinting eyes. He sprinted blindly into the woods, his lungs burning, ignoring the branches that tore at his skin. The only thought in his mind was to get away. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint light through the trees. A small cabin. He staggered toward it, praying that someone was inside, someone who could help him. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, and a moment later, an elderly man opened it, his face creased with concern. Please, someone's out there, Tyler gasped, barely able to speak. The old man looked past him out into the dark forest, his expression turning grim. You need to come inside, he said softly, ushering Tyler in and locking the door behind him. As they sat in the dimly lit cabin, Tyler told the man everything, describing the figure, the laugh, the terrible eyes. The old man listened, his face pale, his gaze distant. You saw him, the man murmured. The Shadow Watcher. He's a spirit that haunts these woods, searching for the ones who wander too close to his lake. He looked at Tyler, his eyes filled with both fear and pity. People who see him rarely make it out. Tyler's skin prickled as he listened, the reality sinking in that he'd escaped something ancient and sinister. The man warned him to stay, to wait until morning before he tried to leave, and Tyler, shaken and exhausted, agreed. But as the old man turned to douse the lantern, Tyler noticed something strange, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow stretching across the floor, one that didn't match the shape of either man. It moved slowly, creeping toward him, and then he heard it again, that terrible, guttural laugh, echoing from somewhere deep within the shadows, as though the forest itself had followed him inside. The drive up to Maple Hill Asylum was grueling, each mile up the winding mountain road, bringing Sam closer to the place that had haunted her nightmares for years. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, a decrepit relic looming over the town below, shrouded in rumors of ghostly wails, flickering lights, and the unsolved mystery of the last doctor to work there, Dr. Amelia Frost. Stories told of her disappearance and the sinister experiments she conducted on her patients. For years, it was whispered that some patients hadn't died but had been transformed into something that could only be described as inhuman. Sam had always been drawn to dark places, an addiction she couldn't shake. She'd come prepared with a flashlight, camera, and audio recorder. This was her passion, documenting the paranormal. She'd convinced herself that tonight would be like any other investigation, just another decaying building. But she knew, deep down, that Maple Hill was different. The asylum was surrounded by thick woods, and as she parked and looked up at the towering structure, a chill crept down her spine. Its empty windows were like dark eyes staring back, cold and unfeeling. She stepped out of her car, her footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement as she approached the heavy iron gates. They creaked open with a reluctance that sent goosebumps crawling up her arms. She glanced around. The silence was unnerving, as if the very air around her was holding its breath. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of peeling walls and hollow rooms, each more unsettling than the last. Graffiti covered the walls, but there was something else there too, strange symbols scratched into the paint. Symbols that didn't belong. They twisted and spiraled in unsettling ways that made her stomach churn. She pressed record on her audio device, half expecting to hear nothing but silence. Yet almost immediately, a low static hiss filled her headphones, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. She pulled the headphones off, heart racing, but the static still filled the air around her, as if the very walls were buzzing with energy. Pushing onward, she reached what had once been the operating room. Rusted equipment lay scattered, their metal surfaces tarnished, some of them darkened with stains she preferred not to identify. The room was a mess of medical instruments, their sharp edges gleaming faintly, even in the dim light. And then she saw it, a set of handprints smeared in rust-brown stains across the wall, leading up to the ceiling. They looked too fresh, almost wet, like they had been painted there just hours before. Sam's chest tightened, but she forced herself to take a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a brief moment. Then she heard it. A faint shuffling sound from somewhere behind her, like footsteps scraping across the floor. She turned slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no one there, but the shuffling grew louder, moving closer, circling her. Panic surged, but she forced herself to remain calm, whispering into her recorder, "Is anyone here?" For a long moment, there was only silence. And then a whisper, so close it felt like it was right beside her ear. "Why did you come?" She froze, a cold sweat breaking out over her skin. She whipped her flashlight around, but the room was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to press in closer. Her hands shook as she replayed the recording, and there it was again, clear as day. "Why did you come?" She staggered backward, bumping into one of the old hospital beds, its wheels squeaking eerily. She needed to leave, she realized, and quickly. The air had grown thick and suffocating, laced with an unnatural chill that made her bones ache. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. A figure at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs stretched and twisted at odd angles like it was made of shadows. She raised her flashlight, and for a split second, she saw its face, a distorted mask of a human face, with eyes that burned with an unnatural yellow light, a twisted grin that stretched too wide. She stumbled back, her heart racing as it began to move toward her with an unsettling, jerky gait. Sam ran, heart pounding, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway as she tried to find her way back. But the asylum felt like it was shifting around her, its walls narrowing, its halls twisting as if it wanted to trap her. Every corner she turned, she caught glimpses of the shadow figure, always just behind her, always watching with those terrible yellow eyes. Finally, she burst into the main corridor, spotting the exit up ahead. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Standing in the doorway was another figure, shorter, more human, but its face was hidden beneath a doctor's mask, a long white coat stained with dark patches. She knew instinctively that this was Dr. Amelia Frost. The doctor raised a hand, beckoning her closer, and for a moment, Sam felt a pull, an almost magnetic urge to obey. She fought against it, but her legs felt weak, her mind foggy. She heard whispers filling the air around her, voices layered on top of each other, growing louder and louder until she could barely hear herself think. "You came to see us," a voice whispered. "You belong here now." The doctor's mask tilted, and beneath it, Sam saw a glimpse of her face, if it could still be called that. It was a hollowed, eyeless visage, the skin stretched taut over bone, a gaping mouth locked in an eternal scream. And behind her, the shadow figure loomed, its yellow eyes glowing with a hunger she felt deep in her bones. With a surge of desperation, Sam bolted, slipping past them and racing out the door, not stopping until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers shaking as she locked herself inside and started the engine. She glanced back at the asylum, half expecting to see those figures standing at the entrance, watching her. But the doorway was empty, the asylum silent once again. As she sped down the mountain road, heart racing, she checked her audio recorder. The entire drive, she couldn't bring herself to look back at the asylum, but she kept replaying the last bit of recording, trying to understand what she had heard. A faint whisper echoed through the tape, layered beneath static, repeating the same phrase over and over, growing louder with each playback. "You'll come back. They always do." And she knew with a sinking feeling that it was right. The mist rolled in thick and fast, swallowing up the street in an unnatural blanket of silence. Mia clutched her umbrella tightly, its flimsy fabric doing little to protect her from the biting rain that had been falling steadily all night. She hadn't planned to be out this late, but the train had stopped unexpectedly 2 towns over, and she'd had no choice but to walk back through the old neighborhood. The streets were empty, lined with crumbling buildings and flickering streetlights. Even her phone, which she'd been using as a flashlight, was down to 5%. As she made her way down the street, she noticed an old man sitting alone on a bus bench beneath one of the few working streetlights. He was hunched over, dressed in an old raincoat and staring at the ground, muttering to himself. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but the words sounded like an old nursery rhyme, repeated over and over in a voice that was almost sing-song. She considered ignoring him and moving along, but something about his frail figure under the light made her stop. "Excuse me, are you all right?" she asked, her voice sounding loud in the quiet night. The old man didn't look up, didn't even seem to acknowledge her. But his muttering grew louder, and she could make out the words now, chillingly clear. "When the lights go out, they come around. Don't look back, don't make a sound." A shiver ran down her spine. She had heard that rhyme before, years ago, when she was a child. It was something her grandmother used to say about the shadow people that supposedly haunted this part of town. Old wives' tales, she'd always thought. Until now. The old man kept repeating the words, louder and louder, rocking back and forth. She took a step back, her heart pounding, when suddenly he stopped. The man slowly lifted his head, and his face, bathed in the cold light of the street lamp, was unlike anything she'd seen. His eyes were wide and unblinking, hollow and distant, with a glint of something unnatural deep within. His mouth twisted into a smile, stretching far too wide. "You'd better keep walking, miss," he rasped, his voice low and trembling with something close to fear. "Once you see them, they never leave." Mia didn't need any more encouragement. She turned and walked quickly down the street, the rain pounding down harder, the mist thickening around her. She tried to shake off the encounter, chalking it up to the ramblings of a strange old man, but the words kept ringing in her head. "When the lights go out, they come around." As if on cue, the streetlights began flickering, casting long shadows on the pavement. The lights blinked off, plunging the street into darkness, and then on again, casting their eerie glow. Each time the lights flashed, the shadows seemed to shift, growing larger, moving closer. Her pulse quickened as she hurried her pace, each flicker of darkness filling her with a mounting dread. Then, for just a split second, she saw it, an outline at the end of the street, dark and indistinct, standing unnaturally still. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched it, paralyzed, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. It just stood there, shrouded in the mist, its eyes, if it even had eyes, locked on her. She forced herself to look away, to keep walking, but her steps grew faster, her breath coming out in shallow gasps. She could feel it behind her, that ominous presence. Each flicker of the streetlights seemed to bring it closer, and when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw it again. No longer at the end of the street, but halfway to her, standing beneath a dim, flickering light. It was taller now, towering over her with long, stretched limbs, its face nothing but darkness, save for two faint pinpricks of light where eyes should have been. They stared at her, unblinking, filled with a chilling, predatory hunger. Her legs moved on instinct, breaking into a sprint. She didn't dare look back, the old man's words echoing in her mind, but she could feel it following her, its presence growing stronger, closer. She ran down an alley, hoping to lose it, but her footsteps echoed, bouncing off the walls and mingling with something else, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the ground. She reached an old, rusted gate at the end of the alley, throwing it open and slipping inside, hoping for some kind of refuge. She found herself in a small courtyard, surrounded by the decaying walls of abandoned buildings. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. But the dragging sound hadn't stopped. It was just outside the gate now, close enough that she could almost feel its presence. She backed away, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle her breathing, and squeezed herself into a shadowed corner, praying it wouldn't see her. The figure appeared in the doorway, taller than ever, its dark, twisted form silhouetted against the mist. It moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring her fear. She watched as it turned its head, scanning the courtyard, those terrible pinprick eyes scanning the darkness. Her heart stopped as it paused, its gaze sweeping right over her hiding spot. She dared not move, barely breathing, hoping that it would pass. And then, in one fluid, unnatural movement, it turned directly toward her. She bit back a scream, pressing herself as tightly as she could against the wall, but there was no mistaking it. Those eyes were locked onto hers. The creature moved forward, its footsteps impossibly slow, dragging one leg as it closed the distance. She couldn't look away, transfixed by those awful, piercing lights. Suddenly, the courtyard was bathed in blinding light. Mia blinked, shielding her eyes, and as she looked up, she saw headlights spilling through a hole in the courtyard wall. A car had pulled into the parking lot outside, illuminating the entire area. The creature shrank back, retreating into the shadows, and as the lights grew brighter, it let out a terrible guttural hiss. Mia watched, frozen, as it melted back into the darkness, its twisted form merging with the mist until it disappeared completely. She waited, heart pounding, until she was sure it was gone. Only then did she stagger out of the courtyard, stumbling toward the car. A kind stranger, concerned by her appearance, offered her a ride, and she gratefully climbed in, too shaken to explain. As they drove away, Mia glanced back at the old neighborhood, half expecting to see that figure standing in the mist, watching her, but there was nothing there, only the darkened streetlights and empty buildings. That night, she lay in bed unable to sleep, the events playing on a loop in her mind. She knew it was gone, that she was safe, at least that's what she told herself. But when she finally drifted off, she felt a presence in her room, something watching her from the corner, and a soft, familiar voice whispered into the darkness. They always come back. They're never truly gone.